space. I want to now move over to Ashish. Ashish has tremendous experience being a consultant and being on the boards of a number of startups. Share with you, if you have to advise local brands on going global, what would your message be to them?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I guess both the panelists have spoken very specific about the branding as well as the impact or the kind of a consumer connect with the brand. But if I go about and if I share about working with the SMEs when they are going global, we have always spoken about the banking, finance and all other world. But I think when they are going global, in my perspective, the first and foremost area which I have always looked at is their own mental preparedness to go global. And if I connect with Professor's exact word is, how are you going to sustain your brand promise for next 3 years, 5 years or 10 years? And that's where your sustainability of the brand promise or your product or a service offerings, what you are doing and how are you going to connect, not just for the current year, for the years to come, not also for the current market where you are serving, but also in the market where you are going to expand yourself in the global dynamics. So like what Amrin talked about, that let's say between the UAE and the Saudi, where she's talking about the entire consumer behavior may be different. So I think if I talk about in the preparedness side of the SMEs is concerned is how I stay local and yet have a global vision. And I think that becomes a very, very essential part of it. So 2 areas which I have always consulted with SMEs, and I think over the time those 2 areas have become very, I would say to a great extent, the success stories about the quite a few SMEs have been as their own mental preparedness that why are they going global? Are they trying to replicate their product line or are they trying to replicate their services? And I think that's where the sustainability comes in place. So I talk a lot about their preparedness for the being global, number one. And along with that, I also talked about while they are growing global or why they're trying to make a global perspective, how much prepared they are. Preparedness is not in just terms of capital, but it also in terms of replicating the skill sets concerned. How do I replicate my skill sets? Those skill sets do I have available? Like what Amrin just talked about, one skill set itself is a language. The second skill set could also be is managing the larger team size. The third skill set could also be is managing the scale. Because a lot of time I have seen the SMEs have a vision, but they don't have preparedness in terms of managing that size and the scale. And they think that because we have been managing it, this much operation or this size of the operation, we are naturally ready to manage the larger size of the scale. So my advice to SME is going to be is that we have always heard about this word called feasibility study. But you may want to take away from this panel here is that can we also go back and actually talk about my mental preparedness report? That are we ready? Are we prepared for the going global or are we prepared for being scalable?
Excellent. I just had 2 thoughts which I wanted to share with you. He spoke about a brand promise. At the end of the day, the brand represents the persona of the product, of the organization, of the service that it tries to sell. It's a promise. So one, yes, can it stand the test of time in terms of living up to that promise? The second important thing he spoke about was the big vision. And I want to share a very interesting concept called BHAG, B-H-A-G. And this is a message for all enterprising SMEs here. BHAG is nothing but a big, hairy, audacious goal. And the big, hairy, audacious goal is a big dream that you have when you're nobody. And I want to share with you a lovely story happened a century back. This was a 2-member operation running in downtown New York, which was basically a financing operation, a money lending operation. And one day, one of the partners, and the business was so small, they had 1 table, 1 chair. So when both of them were there, one would have to stand and the other would have to sit. And one day, one of the partners rushed inside and said, one day, we are going to become the largest bank in the world. His partner looked at him very strangely and thought he must have had a little too much last night, and he just left it. But 112 years later, Citibank, when it merged with Chase Manhattan, went on to actually become the largest bank in the world. So ladies and gentlemen, the dream can be much bigger. And if it can be sustainable through a mental preparedness, I think that's the message. Thank you very much, Ashish, for that. Ram, now moving on to you. You've been a consultant for so many years. Tell us, in your experience, how can you help or advise local brands going global?
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
And also link it with customer loyalty because he spoke about sustainability. So yes.
Absolutely. I think it's, so I'll start by saying that the one message that I think all of us should by now have inferred is every large organization out there was an SME at one point of time, right? So the important part is every tree out there had started as a plant and actually came out of a seed, and the concept here is to understand and appreciate that scale inevitable if you actually are dreaming big. But going back to your question, at the middle, at the center of any growth that any organization tends to look at, you could actually, and it's interesting you gave an example of Coke that we all got to see in the video. You could have the product in the middle of a growth, or you could have a customer at the center of your growth. The scale gets to become significantly larger when you actually are focusing to have the customer at the center of your growth plan, right? And that's where the day and age in which we are operating today becomes extremely relevant. The barriers of entry have suddenly vanished the day we actually are talking about having a digital platform. You do not have today the kind of barriers that perhaps players of the yesterday generation had to deal with. Dealing with expansion into other geographies is no longer the same challenge that you actually had, especially when you're talking about creating awareness of your brand. I mean, you said, you are the brand ambassador. So, you actually have, let's talk about the UAE SMEs in this context, right? 60% of the SMEs here are traders and 30% are in services. We hardly have 5 to 10% in the manufacturing space. That makes it all the more interesting and all the more relevant for us to use the platform called the digital platform and avail the internet to its real potential, which could really make a big difference in creating awareness. And the last point I want to go back to is loyalty. Now, just as it's going to be easy for you to enter into the marketplace because the barrier to entry is low, remember the same applies to your competitor, right? So what's going to be critical is actually creating that stickiness with your customer. And that stickiness is going to be not just a function of creating a beautiful brand, but sustaining it with what would be an impeccable service. And that's going to be the hallmark of an ongoing delivery in the SME world. Yeah. And I think I'll conclude by saying that as we move along, we'll talk about a few examples, but what's very, very important is of all the names we spoke about, and we have right here with us examples of very large brands. We talked about Emirates, we talked about Jumeirah, where we are right now. These are all brands that have created a very marquee place internationally, but they all started in much smaller space. Yeah.
Very interesting. And I mean, when he spoke about sustainability, it again boils down to the brand promise. The brand promise is built on something very simple but extremely profound called trust. So the platform is open. And I want to share something that's rather disturbing, but I think it's nice to be on record. It's called the reputation economy, and you can Google this and check this out. The reputation economy is everything about us, or almost everything about us, is right there on digital space, which means your brand's reputation is monitored by the digital space. So what you do to your customers, how you treat them, what kind of services you offer, what is the value proposition, are all being monitored, not just by your competitors, not just by consultants, but by the world at large. And if I want to know more about it, obviously my reputation is at stake. Authenticity, transparency, trust, if these can be built into the brand promise, trust me, you will go a long way. Moving to the last panelist, but not the least, Kara comes with the government perspective. She's a legal advisor in the Dubai Economic Department. Kara, tell us from your experience, how has it been when you look at the whole, concept of, let's say, small businesses, and how the Dubai government, especially the Dubai Economic Department, ensures that the local brand can think big and dream big to go global?
Thank you. Well, we're always pleased to see, numerous success stories, but from the government perspective, we always have to think of the worst case scenario for brands. It doesn't always work out the first time, and in the event that for some reason that the business, doesn't flourish, we have to look at the mechanisms in place to help that business recover. With my role with the Dubai Economic Council, we undertake lots of research and provide policy recommendations that evaluate the laws and regulations that impact on SMEs. And from what we've found is that, one of the major considerations is the insolvency systems and the power they play in empowering global SMEs. So this is one area that I think sometimes overlooked. I mean, I know financing is a very common theme, but we have to look at once, SMEs are in distress, how we can help them recover and how we can help them re-enter the market. There are thousands of SMEs around the world that have found eventual business success inspired by previous failures. And what's important to note is that those that have gone on to find success very often benefit from a debtor-friendly regime, which doesn't put a stigma on business failure and actually lets them carry on and re-enter the market and grow. The nature of an insolvency regime is therefore something that I think a brand has to pay particular attention to in the jurisdiction in which they operate, and have an understanding of, whether it's an enabling environment or something that, that they have to be mindful of. Nowadays, with the internet and globalization, it's widened the pool of SMEs, and it's not merely enough to have a great business idea and a good brand. We find that there are positives from this, that it increases a higher degree of innovation. But on the flip side, competition means that even those brands that, are the most innovative, those behind them that are the most hardworking and competent, don't always necessarily get it right on the first attempt. And obviously we have to be there to help them recover and re-enter the market.
Very interesting. And coming from Kara, representing the Dubai government, I always used to wonder that Dubai itself is a great brand, Dubai Inc., as we call it. The way it's recognized, the way I have the privilege of traveling to different parts of the world, and the moment you say Dubai, people light up. There are all kinds of interesting things that come into their mind, and it's a wow kind of feeling. So if you look at it carefully, it's a conscientious effort to build the brand. And taking off from what she said, she brought in the other dangerous side. So what happens to a brand when it becomes insolvent, or when the company becomes insolvent, is a very interesting dimension to it. And I'm sure that government departments like the Dubai Economic Department would certainly help in ensuring that the brands are able to sustain over time. We're moving to the second round of this discussion, and this is where we're going to get into the specifics of local brands. I mean, I could think of a number of brands that really made it big. The big ones, as we call them, the Emirates, the DP World, the Emirates Airlines, the Etihad Airlines, so on and so forth, Dubai Shopping Festival. But I'd like to spend a little more time on the lesser known ones, but really well reputed. Bait.com. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Bait.com, the largest online recruitment site in the Middle East. It's a miracle in progress. A Baby Shop, for example, one of the leading local brands in retail. We have Souk.com, like Souk Al Mall, we have Souk.com. Dubizzle, these are local brands that are gaining reputation elsewhere. Barakat Juices, which again is a local brand doing pretty well. Arabian Oud, for example. And the number of jewelry shops that are really doing well, not forgetting UAE Exchange. So I want to pick the brains of our panelists to tell us, and with no specific order, let's say, Ram, you start off by saying, pick up a brand that you think you're familiar with and say, what do you think has made this brand successful, local brands?
No, I think it's a beautiful question, because if you look at, let's pick a brand that everybody in the room here would be familiar with, right? I mean, with a very high expatriate population, remittance business is obviously a very critical part of doing business in the UAE. And what better than actually a brand like UAE Exchange, which actually has the name UAE embedded in it.
And still global.
It's global. I think, and I do travel to various parts of the world just as you, and you actually find UAE. I mean, did you know that UAE Exchange is present in about 40 countries? They have 700 offices. I mean, it's unbelievable what that brand has actually created itself, from a global platform. And I think going back to the theme of the discussion, here is a brand that is completely dependent on the end user or the customer, who actually is transacting on a one-on-one basis. It's a transactional relationship that a customer has with this organization. And here is a brand that's built on top of it, which has created a unique proposition for itself in over the years. I mean, I was doing some research to see their Facebook presence. They have about 622,000 Facebook registered users. I mean, that's real use of the digital channel, right? So here is an example of what someone right out here, in this country has actually gone on to prove here.
That's a very interesting example because it also answers some of the challenges posed by Umar and Amreen in the initial part. So can a local brand with a local name go global? I think UA Exchange is a classic example for that. Amreen, now from your perspective, we have a number of local brands that we discussed. What do you think? Some good brands, great stories?
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle. I think I want to throw a question to the audience saying, how many of you, whenever you're looking for anything, a plumber, a fit-out company, as SMEs anyway, go on Google and Google it? Can I raise of hands, please? How many of you go on the internet to find out about anything and everything that you guys need? Okay, I would say 3/4, I would even say 90% of the room. What that tells me is, as offline, online, whatever company you are today, you need to be present online. There's something called impression share, which is on Google, which is, how there's the ads on Google when you go in and you type in, say, plumbers in the UAE, and there's a whole lot of them that come out. Impression share is how many times are you appearing as a percentage of number of people looking for it. So you're a plumber company, someone types in plumbers on Google, click search. If your company comes up, that's 100% impression share. And a lot of us forget about it, especially if you've got offline companies. We've just launched into Saudi Arabia, and I can tell you, I don't have operations there. I don't even have a person sitting in Saudi Arabia. And we've already reached around 200,000 visits within the last month. And that's purely using